Welcome to The Source, where we combine the headlines with in-depth conversations with the newsmakers themselves. Today on the program, super typhoons, earthquakes, and major natural disasters. The president green-lights a stronger department focusing on disaster response.
I am calling both houses of Congress to expeditiously draft a law establishing a new authority or department that is responsive to the prevailing 21st century conditions.
But what are the chances Congress will pass a Disaster Resilience Act? Undersecretary for Disaster Resiliency Karen Jimeno joins us live. And later, take a trip down memory lane and look at Lebanon's quest in the outer space. That's for today's In Focus. Thank you for joining us. Sitting in for Pinky Webb, I'm Ruth Cabal. The Duterte administration pushes for a new law and department that seeks to address the country's needs in times of a major natural disaster. President Rodrigo Duterte and his cabinet members approved a proposal to create a disaster resilience law that would primarily focus on natural disasters. The law aims to rationalize the use of funds and unite government agencies during a disaster. And in a country that is dubbed to be one of the most vulnerable when it comes to disaster, how urgent is it to pass this law? Let's go straight to the source of the story, Undersecretary for Disaster Resiliency, Karen Jimeno. Welcome back to CNN Philippines, Attorney Karen.
Thank you.
Karen.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for having me.
First of all, gusto ko kamustahin ka muna from your shift from DPWH, Public Works, and now as USEC for Disaster Resiliency.
Well, I think it's, for me, it's been a very enriching experience, and they're all coming together to be, I think, a very cohesive background, because I also worked under President Aquino before as head for external affairs during the rehabilitation for Typhoon Yolanda with Senator Ping Lacson. So in that position, I was able to work with the other government agencies in terms of preparing a rehabilitation plan. And then with the Public Works, I saw how it was to implement projects. So now that I'm preparing this, fixing our policies on disaster resilience, I think it helps to have those backgrounds.
At medyo maganda rin tong topic natin for today dahil nakita naman natin the past few days medyo maulan talaga dito, and we've been having the same problems, and also that's one of the things that you want to address, yung mga long term in terms of dealing with typhoons, ano. But let's go back. We're actually talking about this because this is one of the directives of President Duterte during his State of the Nation address last year. Let's go back to his speech.
I am directing the Cabinet Cluster on Climate Change and Adaptation and Disaster Risk Management to immediately work hand in hand with the concerned LGUs, the private sector, and the affected communities themselves in undertaking disaster measures, antidotes. We will need to act and fast.
And related to that, just last week pala, the Cabinet approved this proposal to create a separate disaster management resilience agency. Can you tell us more about that? And why do we need a separate department?
I was there, Ruth, and I presented to the Cabinet along with Assistant Secretary Paula Alvarez of the Department of Finance. And our presentation was headed, meaning ang nag-introduce was no less than Department of National Defense Secretary Delfin Lorenzana, who's currently the chairman of the NDRRMC, or the Disaster Risk Council. And he supports, Secretary Lorenzana also supports separating the way we have to manage and respond to human-induced disasters and natural-made disasters or natural disasters. So basically, I think with the president, who also has over 20 years of experience as a local executive, he sees the urgency and the importance of having a central authority, but also he recognizes the fact that the current structure that we have does not really work that well in terms of not just the way we respond to disasters, but the risk reduction and preparedness. Because right now, we're the third most disaster risk-prone country in the whole world.
Yes.
But when we talk about disaster risk-prone, it's not just that we're exposed to the natural hazards of volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, typhoons. It's also the fact that our vulnerability is very high, meaning yung mga factors that increase vulnerability like poverty, the types of structures, the quality of structures that we have, and also the type of institutions that we have as well, including yung insurance. So basically, if we look at the different countries that also have best practices, like Japan.
Yes.
They're so exposed. They're also in the Pacific Ring of Fire, but they're not very high on the disaster risk index because they were able to reduce their vulnerabilities. And right now, they have a disaster management bureau. And it's basically centralized the way they handle disasters, but they also have a lot of autonomy in the prefectures and in each of the cities. It's basically, I think, for us trying to find a structure that works given the peculiarities also of the Philippines.
Pero with the present setup now, yung sa NDRRMC, di ba sila yung nangunguna ngayon pag may mga disasters, nasaan yung problema?
One, yung council setup. That's already a problem. We have a council na, if in terms of what do they do, they're all part-timers. We have Secretary Lorenzana, the Secretary for National Defense, as the chairman of the council, and then all the other members, including the co-chairman, the Department of Interior Local Government, the Secretary for Social Welfare and Development. Lahat sila, they have their own jobs. In fact, there's a 2014 DBM report that looked into the absorptive capacities and the implementation of projects by government agencies. What they found back in 2014 was the DSWD poorly performed. They were not able to implement their projects very well. And if you read the report, it says that they concentrated, DSWD at that time, concentrated on implementing a lot of their Yolanda rehabilitation, related projects, that their regular projects were not implemented well. So, long story short, Ruth, like having a council, you have so many people meeting that it's not even their full-time job. So they usually just send representatives. But even then, one of the bills pending in Congress now that pushes for also the creation of the department, one of the shortcomings of one of the existing bills is that it also keeps the council and increases the membership to 64. So can you imagine meeting 64 people? Pag-arrange pa lang ng meeting place, ng venue, and then ang joke na namin, pansit at kape pa lang, gagastos na for all of those people.
64, ano?
And to even come up with decisions, that's so difficult, yung consultative. And if you look at the president's style, he likes to talk to just one person in terms of the way he created task forces, even the task force for Boracay. And even in other countries, that is what works well. The rehabilitation of Aceh Nias, wherein they suffered from a tsunami and an earthquake na magkasunod, they were able to rehabilitate very quickly and very well. And if you read their book, 10 Management Lessons Learned, number one there is create a central authority with sufficient powers. And they did that in the person of Dr. Pac Contoro at that time. And he was able to call the shots very quickly and very effectively.
Yung sinasabi mong parang yung use of power also, kasi I remember si former Senator Panfilo Lacson was former appointed as rehab czar, and you even worked for him, ano? Pero may mga ano rin siya before, kasi wala naman pala talaga siyang powers, particularly with the budget. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is where we see some of the shortcomings of the structure we have, because we had a good person appointed as a rehab czar. He has a lot of integrity, a lot of work experience and credibility, but there was no power to speak of. He didn't have the power to implement, to disburse or use funds. The most that he had was coordinating powers. It was created by Memorandum Order number 62 at the time, and because it was only created by the executive, by the president, it could not amend all the legislative regulations that we had on disasters. So it's still the different government agencies that had to implement the plans. So hindi naman kayang pukpukin ni Senator Ping yung kukulitin niya lahat ng department
Iba-ibang
secretaries.
ahensya, oo.
It's really their call. It was up to them to implement. And unfortunately, they were not able to implement very quickly, even after the plan was prepared.
Okay, that was for Yolanda back then, ano.
Yes.
Pero yung isa pang sinasabi na mas gusto niyo yung binanggit mo kanina, unity of command, as well as yung in terms of procurement, you're also looking at that, yung ayusin yung procurement.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we're trying to fix in terms of our ability to not only respond to disasters, but also to prepare for disasters. Because right now, we do have emergency procurement as one of the exceptions, but it's still not that, as we've seen in our experience now, it's still not that effective, especially in a disaster scenario. So there's really nothing stopping us from innovating when it comes to procurement, because why do we have to wait for a disaster to happen
Yes.
before we start preparing for the procurement, especially if we already have yung multi-hazard mapping, meaning we already know which areas are prone to disasters or yung laging binabagyo, laging binabaha. So we can innovate by having, for instance, standby contracts wherein it's contingent upon the happening of certain events. So let's say it's an area na flood-prone like Tacloban, may storm surge risk also. We can identify areas near Tacloban, let's say even private supermarkets that can provide relief goods para hindi rin kailangan na doon i-store, because that's what happened during Yolanda.
Right,
Na yung pinaposition nilang goods, yun mismo yung tinangay din nung nag-storm surge. So basically, we can have a procurement contract na pag merong certain conditions, if like disaster happens, and then
Pwede
ito
na
yung
agad
mga
yung kontrata.
isusupply, canned goods, water, and then mag-agree na on the price. So it's basically, it's been negotiated, it's awarded, and then it will only take effect if all of those conditions
Conditions are
happen. So
satisfied,
it's a
oo.
contingent contract. So those are the things that we can innovate when it comes to procurement that apply, because disasters are peculiar. You cannot predict, and you don't know when it's going to happen, but you have to act very quickly when it happens.
But Yusek, can you tell us, when you say the cabinet has approved the proposal, what's going to happen? Kasi may pending bill, syempre, because it's a law, it should pass through Congress. So may certain features, but what's going to happen with the cabinet approval?
So basically the value of the cabinet approval is that it has been certified by the president as one of his priority legislation. And also, we have all the other government agencies being on the same page. That's very important, because a lot of the members of the Disaster Risk Council are members of the cabinet who were present at that meeting. And all the laws that are now existing in Congress and in Senate, there are about 10.
Yeah.
And hindi nag-uusap-usap. So what we want is for the bills not to compete among themselves. We don't favor any specific bill, but we do know clearly what the president wants in terms of improving our disaster preparedness and response and rehabilitation. And that means meron tayong disaster resilience for the whole country and having 3 pillars, yung disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness and response, and then the rehabilitation and building forward better. So yun yung importante. So right now we're looking at all the bills and looking at what's good, the good provisions, and then having one version that really addresses what we need for our country.
But to clarify, it's a priority or certified as urgent? Anong
It's
classification?
going to be certified as urgent.
Okay. So if ever, you will come up with one proposal na i-forward nyo na rin for Senate or Congress, or the House?
Yes. So we are working on also, so meron tayong we have our own version, but then
They
we're
have to
taking
file
the
it, eh.
good, yes, we're taking all the versions that are good para meron din magamit from those that have already prepared their bills, the draft. So
Okay.
that hindi naman sayang yung effort nila.
We'll talk more about that, and of course, yung preparedness din ng ating bansa for tinatawag nila na the big one. How prepared are we? This is The Source on CNN Philippines. Still to come, we look at the key features of the proposed Disaster Resilience Act. Undersecretary for Disaster Resiliency Karen Jimeno will still be with us after the break. You're watching The Source on CNN Philippines. Our guest today, Undersecretary for Disaster Resiliency, Karen Jimeno. Yusek, let's discuss one by one yung mga features ng gusto nyo dito sa separate department for, what do you plan to call it, Papa?
Department of Disaster Resilience.
Okay.
Or something similar to that.
So, can you tell us yung mga main features niyan?
Well, one, unity of command. That's really very important, that there's one person calling the shots and also directing everyone else when it comes to disaster, everything that has to do with disaster preparedness, risk reduction, and rehabilitation. So, and then the next important thing is it has to be focused on natural disasters because there are other types of skills that are applicable when it comes to natural disasters. It has to be science-based. You have to consider all the multi-hazard mapping, and it relates also to land use planning because it's something that you can prevent a disaster from happening. The natural hazard will be there, but you don't have to expose the people to the hazard if you plan properly. So those are related because if you look at human-induced disasters, they're usually related to terrorism or problem, for instance, with Marawi, the ISIS threat, even the problems with, let's say, proliferation of drugs or even territorial disputes. Those are human-induced, and you'd require a different set of expertise, different approach.
So yeah, I was going to ask you that. So who will take care of yung mga human-induced
It's
disasters?
still the Department of National Defense.
Okay.
And it would, I think, help if they can really concentrate on ang dami na nun by itself.
But like the case of Boracay, di ba? That's, di ba, natural, sinasabi nila natural-made disaster. Yun, pag ganon, paano mangyayari doon? It was NDRRMC who recommended the state of calamity there.
Yes, and but the task force was created to address the problem with Boracay, and it was the Department of Environment Secretary Simatu that headed the task force. But if we look at even how we approach some of the major disasters, let's take examples like Typhoon Pablo.
Yeah.
And then Typhoon
Mindanao,
Yolanda, and then we had the Zamboanga siege, and then of course the Marawi crisis. These all happened under Republic Act 101/21, which is the current disaster risk reduction management law that we have. But even then, even those four examples, laging nagta-task force, which kind of points to either a perennial shortcoming or gap in our law, or the fact that task forces work well. But what's in a task force? It's the unity of command. It's the ability to decide quickly. And that's what we want in terms of having a way to deal with disasters. Unity of command with having a central authority with sufficient power so that you give them the right ingredients to succeed and not to fail, which is what we've been seeing as a flaw in our system for the past years. So a council setup, it doesn't prevent, if you have a central authority, that authority from consulting. But having a council setup kasi as something that's required by law, it kind of also delays the decision making or makes it also more cumbersome, especially if you have a multi-membership council with people who have other jobs
to
or
do.
other concerns, diba, to take care of.
So what's going to happen to the NDRRMC?
The idea is to not have the NDRRMC.
So i-abolish na siya?
Oh, that's the goal, of course.
But that's under a law, di ba?
Yes, that's why we need a new law, and it's about time na rin, Ruth, because the current law we have, Republic Act 101/21, has a sunset provision which requires the Oversight Committee to evaluate and assess the effectivity of the law and what needs to be changed. And that's, from our observation, one of the things that needs to be changed, not to have a council set up anymore, and to have more unity of command. And the other things that we want to include in this bill or this law would be the way we also disburse funds related to disasters. Currently, we have, even when it comes to calamity funds, we have a long process wherein the implementing agency, whether it's the local government unit or a national government agency, would have to request for OCD to evaluate their proposal. OCD evaluates it and then recommends to the council, and then the council chairman then endorses to the
Haba ng
president.
proseso.
The president
Oo.
then will either approve or disapprove and then go to the DBM and then the DBM will release the SARO or the cash allotment. So, ganun kahaba. And sometimes that process takes several months. Bumabalik pa dun sa pabalik-balik pa sa regional offices. In some cases that we've looked at, it has taken over a year just to
Before
release the
the
calamity
release.
fund. And even me, I remember when I was still Undersecretary for Public Works, I sat in a hearing before in Senate wherein they were hearing or inquiring as to why the Quick Response Fund, which supposedly has a shorter process, is not quick daw. So those are the things that we really have to fix. We're showing now kung ano yung
Process ng sa
mahaba.
funds, di ba?
Oo,
Oo.
so chairman to the recommends to the
So you hope
president.
to fix that with a new agency, ano? Kasi nga direkta na dun sa agency, unlike NDRMC na iba-iba pa yung ahensya na magre-request.
Yes, and it's not just direct to the agency, but also coming up with a process that is not too cumbersome, mas mabilis, mas flexible and responsive.
So sa ngayon ba, do you have any idea who could possibly lead this new agency, this new department?
Wala pa. We have a long way to go in terms of fighting this with Congress, with a version that really addresses all the concerns that need to be addressed. But also, after that, then the search will have to take place kung sinong appropriate for this department. And we really need someone with
Expertise
experience
talaga, eh.
and a lot of managerial skills. I think, Ruth, a lot of people underestimate what it takes to manage or reduce risk and also to manage disaster. You really need a lot of managerial skills as well. Yun nga yung, hindi lang yung well-meaning na person or a person with a good heart, but a lot of managerial skills because even the way you preposition the goods or make those types of decisions, again, disaster preparedness, it requires also having post-disaster needs assessment team that can be deployed very quickly kasi it's also something that you need when you prepare a rehabilitation plan. Kasi hindi naman nila huhulaan ilan yung nasirang school, classrooms, ilan yung nasirang bahay. They need to have people on the ground and that requires a lot of technical expertise.
Yes. Briefly lang din, kasi isa rin sa gustong patutukan ni President Duterte, yung preparation for the big one. So, how prepared are we? Where are we?
Right now, the assessment is that we're underprepared.
For the big one, we're talking about the magnitude 7 or greater than that earthquake, right?
Yes, and FIVOC's Dr. Solidum, Undersecretary Solidum, said that we're overdue for the big one because it's every 400 years.
Yes.
And it's way beyond 400 years na. And the problem is we have all our eggs in one basket. Meaning, pag tinignan nyo ang Pilipinas, nasa Manila lahat yung andito ang seat ng Office of the President,
Airports, seaports,
airports, even our financial district from the private sector. It's all in Metro Manila. So the problem is we're not prepared. Even some of our major thoroughfares like Guadalupe Bridge, it's bound to collapse now if we have the big one. So the President recognized this urgency and he signed an executive order just this May 2018, that created a project management office to start preparing for the big one. And this is by executive order, but this project management office is going to be working with all the government agencies on what needs to be prepared. It's going to be headed by an executive director, pero up to now, hindi pa nakakahanap appoint for that post.
Okay.
But at least to give credit to the cabinet members and Secretary Lorenzana, he's been chairing meetings, bringing all the relevant government agencies together. In fact, we just had one last week, and it was in Quezon City Hall, because Quezon City is the biggest LGU we have in Metro Manila. So we were able to also check on the status of where they are in terms of preparedness and all the other government agencies in terms of what they've done already, where we are. So patuloy naman yun.
Pero Yusek, yun na nga, yung point natin is to have a centralized agency and this one is another office naman na nakafocus sa the big one. But for now, ano nang status nitong, when can we expect possibly to pass this bill?
We're hoping that it can be passed by this year. And I hope that can happen because Congress, of course, there will be a lot of changes with the upcoming elections.
Yes.
In a sense, changes in terms of pati their presence to sit in sessions when the campaign period starts. So hopefully we can pass it by this year because again, the urgency is there. We're the third most disaster risk prone in the world, and we lose so much money, Ren, economically every year. According to the Philippine Development Plan, in agriculture alone, we lost about 162 billion pesos because of disasters, and not to mention the lives lost. So it's very important that we deal with this quickly, and I hope that Congress also recognizes the urgency.
Okay, thank you very much, Undersecretary for Disaster Resiliency Karen Jimeno. This is The Source on CNN Philippines. Coming up, it's not only the United States and Russia, but another country dreamt of exploring the outer space. That's for today's In Focus.